some information that will be able to help you and your organization. At this time, I would like to bring on our host, our Congressman Hank Johnson. Congressman?
Thank you, Eric, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for joining us this week to learn more about the federal grants process. And I also want to recognize and thank all of the presenters, organizations, and agencies that partnered with my office to make this event a success. I hope you found the information they shared to be useful and informative as you determine how best to navigate what can often be a very challenging process. I also want to take a moment to welcome so many new organizations that have not partnered with my office before. Thank you for the important work that you do on the ground across our communities to make Georgia's 4th District an inclusive and welcoming place to work, live, and play for all. And we look forward to your partnership moving forward. This is a very special week. It's my week of hope, which is a dedicated week of service to our nonprofit partners, which recognizes their immense work serving the working people and families of Georgia's 4th Congressional District. Our grants workshop kicked off our week-long celebration. As a quick summary of this week's seminar, on day one, Kimberly Jo Eck of Emory University joined us to educate folks on how to tackle writing a grant proposal. This process can be daunting, but it is a crucial step in securing funding for many nonprofit organizations. Her best practices and strategies are ones that all organizations should know when taking on that task. On day two, we heard from Charles Sperling, the Executive Director of STAND Incorporated, and Kyle Bryant, a Senior Environmental Justice Specialist with the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, who shared their tips on submitting a successful grant application. As federal agencies weigh countless grant proposals from across the country, we want to make sure yours includes the right materials, supporting documents, and letters of support that will help you stand out and make the case that your organization deserves funding. On day three, we were joined by representatives from the U.S. Department of Justice, Department of Housing and Urban Development, and the Environmental Protection Agency, who shared more about potential grant opportunities within those agencies. Learning what grant opportunities are available if your organization qualifies and what the grant funding cycle looks like can open doors to new funding streams that you didn't know existed. Today, my legislative director, Carla Kaiser, will give us an overview of a relatively new process for funding through the annual federal appropriations process, community project funding. Last Congress, House Democrats brought this type of funding back for the first time in more than a decade. It is fair and transparent and has given members of Congress the opportunity to have a direct say in where funds are spent in their districts. It has been very successful, and I'm thankful that the process is still ongoing. For the new fiscal year, our office secured 15 projects across our district worth more than $14.3 million. We hope today's presentation helps you prepare for this process in the new year. Today also marks the reason for this week's celebration. It's National Nonprofit Day. While we celebrate our nonprofits and the fantastic work they do every day, we especially want to highlight just how essential they are in the lives of so many people across our communities. Our Week of Hope continues tomorrow, August 18th, when I will join a nonprofit in the district for a Day in My Shoes event. Our organization to learn about the work they do, caring for others, while hearing from those whom they serve. And Saturday, August 19th, is the culmination of our Week of Hope with our Ceremony of Hope, also known as Helping Other People Elevate. I will be highlighting nonprofit organizations throughout Rockdale, Newton, and DeKalb counties that have made tremendous impact on the lives of others through public service. Last but certainly not least, I want to give a special shout out to my terrific staff for this week's grant seminar and Week of Hope events. They truly go above and beyond to make sure our governmental and nonprofit organizations have everything they need to succeed. Since taking office in 2007, one of my mantras has been taking care of home first. As your congressman, I take this responsibility very seriously, and so do my staff. I'm thankful for their efforts every day in serving you and the people of Georgia's 4th District. Thank you again for joining us, and we look forward to being of service in the days ahead. And I will return it now to the host.
All right, Hala. All right, wonderful. So hi, everybody. Good afternoon. My name is Hala Kaiser, and as Congressman Johnson just stated, I am his legislative director. It is a true honor and privilege to do this presentation with you all today. So if you could just bear with me a moment, I'm going to do a quick screen share here and get my presentation going. So just a moment. All right, so just want to make sure that everybody can see that. Candace, could you just let me know that the presentation is there? Excellent, wonderful. So as I mentioned, my name is Hala. We're going to go through an overview today about the appropriations and community project funding process. And just to give you a few announcements at the outset, first of all, these slides and this recording will be available for you all to peruse at a later date. So don't feel that you need to have to capture every single thing I say to you today, because there is a lot of information coming your way. And secondly, please hold any questions that you may have about this presentation until the very end, and keep an eye out for a poll that we will be doing at the conclusion of this presentation. So without further ado, I will begin, since I know our time together is limited. So appropriations is such a complex and interesting process, and it's normal for you to be wondering, where does this even stem from? What's going on here? And that might actually harken back to your days in high school. You may remember from one of your civics classes that this is actually a process that is enumerated in the U.S. Constitution, right? So in Article 1, Section 9, Clause 7, the founding fathers basically wrote that Congress has the power of the purse. And so this is a responsibility that falls upon Congress on a yearly basis to keep the government functioning, and that means keeping the government funded. And if the government is not funded and there is any lapse, then that is what results in a government shutdown, which all of us are familiar with. So each fiscal year basically runs from October 1st through September 30th. Currently, we're in FY 2023, fiscal year 2023, and the process to set up spending for FY 24 is already underway. And every single year, Congress basically has to pass new appropriations bill. And that process is a very multi-layered and complex process that involves numerous moving parts, which I will go over with you today. But some of the key elements to remember right at the outset is that these appropriation bills must be passed by both chambers. That means the House and the Senate, and then they must be signed into law by the president. And that must all be done by September 30th in order to avoid a government shutdown, right? And I'll get into some of the variables that come into play, but that's sort of a big picture approach of what's going on here. So in terms of the timeline of how this typically works, the president usually releases his budget in February or March of every year. So last year that was late March, this year it was early March. And basically the president's budget is indicating to the American people what his priorities are, right? What is he hoping to achieve by investing his budget in one bucket as opposed to a different bucket? And that signals to all of the relevant stakeholders, including members of Congress and senators, of his calculus and his decision-making process. Meanwhile, the House appropriations process is typically taking place between February and March. One of the key things that you want to remember here is that this process, in terms of the timeline, varies year by year. So it's a bit fluid, and it's a bit of a moving target. So I couldn't say for sure that next year it'll be in February or March. We just know that it's going to be around that time. And the appropriations process is what includes what are known as community project funding, which you all are most likely know at least a little bit about, and that I'm happy to shed some light on today. So community project funding, otherwise known as CPFs, are basically when funding is allocated for a specific project that's located in a Congress member's district. And this year and last year, each Congress member's office was permitted to submit a total of 15 CPF requests. In past years, that number was only 10. This year, it has been 15, and we're hoping to continue and to see that trend of 15 moving forward. And the deadline for those projects for fiscal year 24 were in March and April of this year. Now, before I move forward, I do want to flag that the deadline to submit CPFs for fiscal year 2024 has already passed. So the conversation that we're having today is really intended to prepare you and gear you up for the upcoming fiscal year after that, which is going to be 25. And so this is really to help prepare you for your applications for early spring of next year. We cannot do anything anymore about the FY24 process, which has already sort of moved on and it's in process. So just wanted to let you know about that from the outset. So moving right along. Many people wonder, what are the eligibility requirements? What do I have to be able to demonstrate in order to be able to successfully move my project along? And before I get into the details, I do want to flag that eligibility requirements typically have little to no flexibility, and that's because these decisions are made by House leadership, they are carefully negotiated, and so there's not often that much wiggle room. And so I'm going to go over it a little bit just to sort of help you understand the parameters of what you're about to get into. So first of all, CPFs are only eligible for governmental or nonprofit entities. That means that if you're an individual or a for-profit entity, you are strictly prohibited from receiving funding. And as I said before, this is a hard rule. Next, your project would need to demonstrate that it can utilize all funding within a year of receipt from the agency. If you're not able to demonstrate that, then one of two things could happen. Either the funding may be clawed back because you can't demonstrate that you can use it in that timeline, or alternatively, your project might not be selected because an alternative CPF can show that they can utilize the funding within 1 year of receipt. So in order to be the most competitive, you want to be able to show the ability to use your funds within that calendar year. Next, demonstrating strong community support. So this is pretty self-evident, but what it's really important to remember, and that really cannot be understated, is that having strong support from community leaders such as mayors, legislators, stakeholders, and constituents are going to be key to moving your project along. Having positive news articles, having interesting conversations about it that are already in place are going to be critical. And the reason for that is because we definitely want to submit a project that has the highest chance of being funded. And so if you're able to demonstrate that so many people in the district care and are concerned and are invested in this project, then that's a strong showing of support. And then next, describing how the federal funding will help address a specific community need that demonstrates why it's essential, right? So projects that are located in the district that are helping constituents, maybe elevating communities of color, maybe demonstrating how a historically marginalized or underserved community will have greater access, possibly connecting Americans from different backgrounds, connecting people through transit pathways, you name it, but something that really shows a demonstrable need that is supported and that will have a positive impact on the community and the constituents. And then lastly, the projects must demonstrate a federal government nexus. This can be a little bit wonky, so I wouldn't get too worried about it at the outset, but it is a new requirement that House Republicans have instituted. And basically, it requires applicants to show that their funding can fall within current statute, current law. And if you're able to get to this part in the process, we can provide you with some guidance on that to help you sort of maneuver with the federal government nexus. But you definitely want to make sure that all these other parts of your application are pretty set. So here's some additional guidance that you should be mindful of when you're moving forward with your application. There are 12 appropriation subcommittees, as we all know, and you may wonder, which subcommittee does my project fall under? It's not going to fall under any and all 12. Some of them are actually even precluded from having CPFs, but there are a few that are the most likely that your project is going to fall under. And those are the first two that are listed on this slide, right? So if you look at the transportation, housing, and urban development, otherwise otherwise known as THUD. That is among the top subcommittees that is going to be eligible for CPFs. So that would include examples like a transit expansion, bicycle and pedestrian pathways, airport improvement expansions, road extensions, things like that. And then the second most likely subcommittee is Interior, otherwise known as Interior, Environment, and Related Agencies. This would include things like improvements to wastewater treatment plants and retrofitting existing infrastructure. And in fact, if you were to look at the FY24 submissions that we did have, Congressman Johnson's submissions are basically among those two categories. And then there are some other options such as agriculture and rural development, commerce, justice, and science, energy and water, which might include some Army Corps projects, Homeland Security, and MilCon. But the primary ones will probably be THUD and Interior. Now, I do want to add the caveat that this information that I'm giving you is based off of our understanding of the process as it was conducted this year. And so we are relying on the assumption that House leadership, Republican leadership, will continue to build on precedent. It's unlikely that they're going to start from scratch all over next year. More likely than not, they will build on precedent, and that's where this information is coming from. So assuming everything continues as it's been, those are the two most likely. And then meanwhile, which appropriation subcommittees do not accept CPF requests? One of the notable ones is Labor, Health and Human Services, otherwise known as Labor HHS. This subcommittee previously accepted CPFs in the 117th Congress, and the majority of CPFs that actually were approved did go through Labor HHS just because of the nature of connecting communities in its jurisdiction. But these were actually precluded from having any submissions under the Republican majority, which is something that was outside of our hands. And same goes for financial services and general government. That was also not accepting any CPFs. And then defense, ledge branch, and state and foreign ops, those typically do not anyway accept CPFs. So one of the key recommendations to take away from this presentation so far is review the different committees, have an understanding of which one you're trying to seek eligibility in, and then look at Congressman Johnson's submitted CPFs for FY23 as helpful examples, right? Because if you're able to see what was selected and you're able to see what's possible, then that's really going to provide a model for you to emulate, and that'll give you some guidance. And you can think, well, hey, they were able to get it across the finish line. What do I need to do to be as competitive? And we also highly recommend that you review the guidelines that were released by the Republican majority for FY24, because again, those are a marker of what we can anticipate in FY25. Now, I will let you know that these guidance documents can require reading a couple of times before the information sinks in, just because of the nature of the way that they're written. They might be a little bit wonky. You might need to kind of let that information sort of marinate for a second. But take heart. We've all been there. So just read those documents cover to cover, sometimes multiple times, and then you'll get that guidance. And of course, we're here to answer if any questions come up or anything is confusing. But the guidance is especially helpful. So let's say we're looking at projects, we're reviewing a lot of people who have submitted. What are some common pitfalls that we come across? And some of these might seem to you very self-evident, but the reality is that a lot of hardworking, intelligent people might sometimes not catch this. So it's very important for us to just put it out there so you're aware. Number one, maybe the project is not a nonprofit or governmental entity. And as I said, that is a hard rule. There's really no flexibility there. So you're really going to want to make sure you have that in place before you even start this process. Number two, the project isn't located in the district. Now, on very, very rare instances, would a project that's not located in the district be eligible? But that would only be if it could demonstrate in a very clear way that a high majority of constituents rely on this service or this expansion of some transit corridor or whatnot, and therefore that demand is there. But unless you're able to show that, it's really better to just go for those projects that are in your member's district. Next, the project might not meet cost sharing requirements. Now, this one is also one that really cannot be understated. So, from the outset, I will flag that we understand that cost sharing requirements are no easy stumbling block, right? That requires a lot of work and a lot of community support to build and to have. But these are a requirement of CPFs. And The specifics can definitely vary, and the guidelines will specify that, whether it's an 80-20 cost share or 75-25, but there is going to be oftentimes a cost share. And so you're going to want to be able to demonstrate that your project has the local funding match that's required, because if it doesn't, then it will be very difficult to get it funded. And then there are some other issues that might come up. Maybe your project falls under a subcommittee like Labor HHS that isn't accepting applications, or you're not committing to utilizing your funds within 1 year of receipt. Maybe your project doesn't have enough community support or enough of a community need. Maybe your project's requested funding amount is unreasonably high and you haven't provided an itemized budget breakdown. So we highly recommend that you provide an itemized budget breakdown. And the reason for that is because we're here to help you, right? We want to help these constituents get their project across the finish line. And so if you show us your itemized breakdown, basically we can see, which aspects of that are an eligible expense and which are an ineligible expense. So for example, in this last year, staff salaries and operational expenses were ineligible, but maybe one part of your itemized budget breakdown includes funding for a capital investment project, and that could have been eligible. So if we're able to work with you, as long as you're able to provide us with all of the information and all of the details. And then finally, the project might not demonstrate a clear federal government nexus. That's something that would also be something we'd have to go over, but typically the challenge comes well before that. By the time that comes, you're usually further along in the process. So in order to avoid these pitfalls, we just highly recommend that you review the current guidance, read it through word for word to get a sense of what's going on. So let's say you've done all of this. You've avoided the common pitfalls. You have a nonprofit or governmental entity. You got the federal cost share. You were super thorough and detailed. You had all your ducks in a row, and you were selected as one of the 15 projects that Congressman Johnson is going to put forward. So what happens next, right? My community project funding was selected. What do I do? It's very important to remember that we have to manage our expectations here a little bit. And that kind of goes back to something I mentioned at the start of this presentation, which was that Congress is a very multi-layered institution. There are a lot of moving parts here and different dynamics that sometimes can be outside of our control. So I'm going to give you a bit of an overview of what happens next so that you have a sense of what to expect in this process, because it does take a while to get across the finish line. So step one. The 12 House Appropriations subcommittees typically review all of the requests that were submitted. And remember, that's 15 per Congress member, right? And if you have over 400 members of Congress and each of them has 15, you could do the math and see just how much work that is to review all of those. And then these subcommittees have to develop their bills, and they have to hold these markups where they're basically marking up text and changing the legislation to make sure that everything is accurate and eligible and complies with all of the rules. And so this typically happens between April and May, but also generally stretches into June or July, right? I mean, these processes are long and they're thorough, and they can't be done on quickly. So then step two, the House Appropriations Committee as a whole, so not just the subcommittees, but the whole committee, hold its own markups. And then they look at these spending bills and they make sure that the funding amounts are appropriate, and they do all of these transparency checks and so forth. And that also stretches from into the spring into July, and it may not even be fully completed. That is a possibility that remains. And then finally, step three, the House of Representatives considers all of those appropriations bills, with the goal being that they pass all 12 of them before August recess. There's no guarantee that they'll get it passed before August recess. It may go into September, it usually does. But one of the policy and parliamentary tools that members can use is what are known as minibus packages. And a minibus package is basically combining various appropriations, legislation or bills into little packages. So instead of having 12 individual votes, which would take up a lot of floor time, many days, many weeks, you can kind of put, 6 and 6, or 9 and 3, and figure out a way to get to that 12, but in little packages. One of the challenges we're facing right now, however, is that House Republicans have demonstrated an unwillingness to use minibus packages for FY24 appropriations. So basically, we're in a situation where each of those bills does have to come up individually, and September 30th is looming. So the deadline for the fiscal year is looming, and we have a lot to get done in a short amount of time. Now, this is what everything that I've described for you thus far is really just limited to the House of Representatives. But Congress, as you all know, is a bicameral institution. So that takes us to step 4, right, which is the Senate. Because the Senate has its own process, and the Senate is going to be going on a different timeline than the House is going to be going. And they're going to be figuring their things out with markups and committee conversations and negotiations on their end. So if you have questions about that, or would like to better understand that process, highly recommend that you reach out to the offices of Senator Ossoff, Senator Warnock, and get those details from them on that end. And then we have step 5, which is once these two chambers independently, do their markups, do their negotiations, figure out a bill, maybe even vote it out of committee, vote it out of the House floor or the Senate floor, then they have to do what's known as a conferencing. And these two chambers have to basically agree on a unified legislative text that is basically the same, comma to comma, period to period. And that process can stretch for several months because we're talking about long negotiations about funding agencies and funding programs. And again, remember, the fiscal year ends on September 30th. So if that's not done by that time, we'll enter a government shutdown. Now, there are tools that we have to address these kinds of issues in terms of the timeline that we're facing. And one of those is the continuing resolution. So continuing resolution, otherwise known as a CR, is typically passed to avoid a government shutdown. A CR is basically a short-term stopgap measure. It's basically going to fund the government at the current level that it's already at for just a little bit more time. So if the fiscal year ends on September 30th, maybe we can get a CR until mid-November or mid-December. And that way, members of Congress have a couple more months to do these negotiations and fine-tune everything before they finalize the bill. But here's an asterisk that is especially important for those of you who are interested in getting your community project funding completed, which is that CRs cannot be used as a vehicle to implement CPFs. Okay, so you have CRs and you have CPFs, and they are in two separate lanes. You cannot put them together. So in order for a CPF to actually become law, it must be in a full year funding bill. And full year funding bills, as we know, have to be negotiated and take a long time. And there's a lot of intricacies involved there, which then leads us to step 6. The president has to ultimately sign a full year appropriations bill or a CR to avoid a government shutdown by September 30th. Right. And maybe he'll get a CR for a few months and then he'll sign a full year bill in December. I mean, that's kind of a fluid process right now. What I can tell you is that in June of this year, President Biden agreed to increasing the debt ceiling through intense negotiations with Republican leadership. But one of the extractions that he had to make for that was placing restrictions on government funding for FY24. And in so doing, there are certain levels of funding that were agreed to out of getting the increase to the debt ceiling. The problem, however, that we're facing right now is that Republicans in the House Freedom Caucus want further spending cuts than what were agreed upon in that negotiated deal with President Biden and Republican leadership. And this is, of course, a major stumbling block, right? Because September 30th is right around the corner. It's also important to flag that currently 11 of the 12 appropriations bills have not even passed the House, right? Which goes back to my earlier slide, which was just the House. And so you can see now why this deadline is sort of a major deadline that we're approaching. And without that full year funding bill, CPFs cannot be enacted into law. So that's kind of where we stand right now. But power is ultimately about exerting influence on the things that you can control, right? So let's just focus on those elements because that's what we can actually influence and change. So what can you do right now? Familiarize yourself with the FY24 guidance so you have a sense of what kind of funding is eligible and what's not, right? Seek to have your application materials ready to go well in advance of February 2024, right? That way you don't have to wait and you're not going to be scrambling at the last minute to get all your materials together. Just have everything prepared in advance so that the moment the submission form goes live on Congressman Johnson's website, you're ready to roll. And then keep in mind one of the overarching premises of this entire presentation, right? Which is that funding process is complex. It's subject to myriad factors that are often beyond our control. And so we highly recommend that you don't put all of your funding eggs into this one basket, but instead have contingencies in place, right? Plan to, look at other alternate funding streams, or realize, just know and be prepared for in advance that there could be funding cuts, there could be delays to the funding. And, if they're in the event that a full year bill isn't passed and we do have a CR, that can also have an effect on CPF. So just being mindful of the world of appropriations and the possible factors that could come into play. And then, of course, read and review all of the available guidance and include in your application all of the details as accurately as possible, right? Your legal name, your address, the project address, all of this information, and especially a responsive point of contact for your organization. Because when the appropriations process does ultimately open up, we have a very short window of time in which we have to vet all of these applications and then submit them. And that's a very, very narrow window. And so it's incredibly important that your entity or your group is really responsive and ready to go. So if we have a question that we ask you, you're able to get us that information. And it's okay if you have to, research or find that information, but just being responsive and really just punctual and on top of things is going to make a big difference, mainly because of the time pressure that we fall under when appropriations ultimately does come. And if you have questions about the application, be sure to reach out to us. And if we have questions, we'll of course reach out to you, and just try to include as much information as you can to build a very strong case for your project and its merits, because that's ultimately what's going to affect whether or not it gets chosen. So here are some helpful resources you might want to consider after this presentation. One of them is the Congressman's FY24 disclosure page, just to see which projects he's submitted in the past. Another is to look at the House Appropriations guidance that was provided for FY24, just to see how that was written and to sort of familiarize yourself with that language and how that process works. And then here you can look at the FY24 funding tables. These are basically covering existing member requests that are moving slowly through the process. And so Congressman Johnson's are also included in these various subcommittees. And yeah, always remember that we are here to help, right? We are here to serve. As the Congressman said, he is a public servant, and we are all dedicated to helping all of you. We want to fight for you. And so the more information you can give to us and the more engagement you can do with us, the better we can be your liaison. And so you're welcome to reach out to myself or to our Chief of Staff, Marcus. We can set up meetings with you. We can have email conversations, phone conversations, you name it. It's all available. And then finally, we're going to be turning to the Q&A portion after the poll. And the Q&A portion is just a chance for you to ask any questions you might have about the presentation or this funding process. Of course, if you have a very specific question about your project, I may not be able to tell you the answer to that without having reviewed the materials necessarily, but I'm happy to speak a little bit in generally about the process and what sort of pitfalls you might want to look out for. And in the event that we're not able to answer your question due to the time constraint, please feel free to email us or contact our office, and then we can get back to you that way. So yeah, after that, I will hand it over to my colleague Candace, and I can hit the stop share.
Thank you, Hala. This is Kathy Register, the District Director for Congressman Johnson. Please stay on the call. Candace will now implement a poll. And we would love for everyone on the call to participate. Candace, are you seeing the results?
Yes, I'm seeing the results.
Okay,
I'm
so
just,
let us know when you want to take that down, and we'll get
Sure.
into the Q&A. I don't know if there's some additional questions in the Q&A, but it was really only one question there.
Okay, sure. I'm gonna try to give everybody 30 more seconds.
Okay.
Thank you. I'm sharing, I just shared the result.
Okay, when you close that window, we'll get into the questions. Okay, the first question is there a limit on the number of grant applications that can be submitted? Paula?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. Thank you for that. So what I would encourage you to do is rather than focusing on the breadth and the number of applications, but rather to have a one or two very strong applications. Because while there is no hard and fast limit on the number of applications you submit, what will ultimately matter is the quality of that. And so if you're able to demonstrate robust support from the community and, you know, verifiably a nonprofit or governmental entity that can use that funding in a 1-year time frame, if you're able to show those things, you have the best chance of getting in. And now, having said that, if you just have exemplary applications and you have multiple, then by all means submit them. And we, of course, have to, when reviewing these applications, sort of look at the various counties and the various geographic spaces in the district to make sure that there is equal representation, generally speaking. And that's also part of making sure that all of the congressman's district is reflected. But we certainly don't have any limit on the number that you submit. I hope that's helpful.
Okay, which funding source best suits the issues of homeless individuals and families?
See, this one is a kind of breaks my heart to answer a little bit because homelessness and families are so important, and that typically falls under labor HHS. And labor HHS is now precluded under the Republican majority from being eligible for CPFs. So in the past, for instance, in the 117th Congress, you could have submitted a lot of applications for families and homeless folks and people who need help through that, and that's no longer possible. But what I will say is there's still hope because we have we've read the guidelines and understood them to such a thorough degree that there are opportunities even under transportation that you can kind of fit those in, and it, you know, fits with, as long as it fits within that criteria. So we can work with you, but it still has to be to some degree, you know, possible. We can't just put anything in there, but depending, there can be some subsets within transportation that it could fall under.
Okay, thank you for that. How is the match portion determined? Would that be known prior to submitting an application? And would fire services fall under Homeland Security?
So the match portion really differentiates between on the project itself and the specific parameters of the project and how much you're asking for. And yes, it would definitely be known prior to submitting an application. It would usually be in the guidance that would be released in early spring of next year. And then once we have that guidance, we can also verify and say, okay, yeah, this is the portion of the match. And it typically just depends on what the needs are with the state and then the federal government sort of working collaboratively with the agencies. And they're the ones who are ultimately looking at all those factors. And in terms of the fire services, it depends. I couldn't just say for sure that it falls under Homeland Security. It really depends on, you know, what kind of project it is, what is it doing? We need to see the details of that first.
Okay. Let's see, for first-time home buyer, does HUD have any community project program?
So community project funding is something that members of Congress submit for their district. So if you are a first-time home buyer, that might be in a sort of a different category than community project funding, because community project funding is like let's say there's a specific organization in the district that's asking for like, let's say $1.5 million to build a transit corridor, that connects two neighborhoods. Whereas if you're trying to be a first-time home buyer, you're going to want to look at different set of resources, maybe that are available for you. So they're kind of a different lane.
Does partnerships with nonprofits with similar goals increase the chances of getting funding?
Oh, that's an excellent question. I think that kind of proves or sort of leans into that point about building a strong support network and the demonstrable support for your project. If you have, if you can demonstrate that a variety of nonprofits also are concerned about this issue and they can share letters of support, that's great. If you guys want to coalesce and submit one application together, that works too. But if you're in separate districts, then by all means, submit your application to each member whose district you're located in. But I think that building that coalition of support is usually really helpful in getting your project approved.
Okay. And there are several questions about the webinars, Candace. They want to know if the webinars will be available for view at a later time. And they also want to know if all the Q&A will be included in the recordings that will be posted at a later time.
Sure. So all the recordings will be available on our website sometime next week. It includes all educational material, and it should include other questions that were answered live.
Okay. And then Hala, this is for you. If you have multiple initiatives under your organization, is it okay to submit applications for each initiative that represents domestic violence, at-risk youths, seniors, mental health, or is there just one application?
So that's a good question too. And to disaggregate those various parts of your application, it depends on if they fall under different subcommittees, right? So if it all falls under THUD or if it all falls under a different subcommittee, that's going to make a difference. And if it is under one, then you could submit one application. But if different parts of it fall under different jurisdiction, then that would be different applications. What I can tell you, looking at your question here, youth, senior, mental health, domestic violence, that sounds a lot like labor HHS, which, as I've mentioned before, is unfortunately not eligible under the Republican majority. So that's going to present some challenges, but depending on what your situation looks like, we could review it if you were to submit it in advance for next year and see if there's any way that it could go. But you just want to manage expectations there because, again, labor HHS is not eligible.
Does funding for transitional housing fall under housing and urban development?
It could fall under housing and urban development. I mean, again, it depends on the specifics, but it does sound like it from the outset.
Okay, if a business owner who has been in business over 8 years that offer internship and course curriculum certification to vocational students or industry-specific examples such as HVAC, plumbing, etc., would a grant fall in that area of opportunity?
So based on the precedents so far and the guidance we've had so far, for instance, trainings and staff salaries and operational expenses have not been an eligible expense. So at least from this general overview that I'm getting of your application idea, offering internships that might be paid or doing course curriculum certificates have not to date been eligible expenses. Now that could possibly change in the new year, but given that Republican leadership is less interested in investing in that, it might not be possible.
What website do you find the CPFs on?
Yeah, so there's multiple websites that you're going to want to look for, right? If you want to look at the guidelines, you're going to look at the House Appropriations website, which I linked to in the PPT. If you want to see which 15 CPFs Congressman Johnson submitted, then you're going to want to go to Congressman Johnson's website and then look at the ones that he submitted. But in terms of guidance, just stick to the House Appropriations website because they load those up and they're all publicly available.
Okay, I'm not sure if this person listened in for the entire 4 series, but their question is, I know the series was talking about grant opportunities, but is there an ability to work with the congressman on earmarks? I know several nonprofits from Georgia which have been included in various spending bills.
So earmarks and community project funding are actually the same thing. Community project funding is just a rebranding of earmarks. For those of you who may have been following the news over in the sort of historical development of this issue, you might recall that earmarks had some issues due to wasteful spending. And so for some time, Congress basically put a ban on having any kind of earmarks because the concern was that taxpayer dollars were not being used in a productive and transparent way with good faith intentions. And then after about 10 or so years, earmarks came back, but this time they were known as community project funding. And it's not just a name change, to be fair. There are much stricter and higher transparency standards that go along with this, right? That's why it has to be a non-governmental, non-profit or a governmental entity. It has to have several extra layers of accountability and transparency in order to be eligible. But in terms of actually funding a project in the district for one specific entity, that is what an earmark is, and that is also what a CPF is.
Okay, and this is the last one. For clarity, if you want to develop properties for the first-time home buyers, we should contact Senator Warnock or Senator Ossoff and not Congressman Johnson. I think there's some confusion there.
Yeah, I think that developing properties, I think is sort of a different, might be a little bit different than the CPF projects that we've been talking about. I'd actually have to know more about what's going on there before I could make a recommendation.
Okay, well, I think that concludes all the questions, and thank you again, Hala. And now I'll turn it over to our Chief of Staff, Marcus Gaza.
Thanks, Kathy. Thank you, Hala, for a great presentation. Hello, everyone. Again, my name is Marcus Garza. I'm the Congressman's Chief of Staff in our Washington, D.C. office. And thank you for joining us today for our fourth and final series of our grants workshop. Again, I want to thank my colleague, Hala Kaiser, for helping us demystify the federal appropriations process and community project funding. We hope that many of you now have a better understanding of what this process looks like and consider using it in the future to secure funding. I want to once again reiterate what my colleagues already mentioned, but every presentation we've made available will be made available from this week's workshop series on the Congressman's website sometime next week. Once they are posted, you may find them under the Serving You tab at the top of our homepage at hankjohnson.house.gov. As always, we welcome your questions and comments at any time. Please stay in touch with both our district team and our legislative staff in DC. Congressman Johnson's office is here to serve, and we look forward to helping you as best we can and putting your organization on a pathway to success. With that, this concludes today's presentation. Thanks again for joining us. Have a great rest of your week.